John Cena is one of the rare icons of America, whose name transcends the boundaries of an entertainment sport to become part of the collective memory. For over 20 years, he has not just been a WWE wrestler, he has been the face representing a set of values that millions of American families believe in. With world championship records, sold-out WrestleMania nights, and the slogan "Never Give Up" resounding like a vow, Cena was built into the image of absolute resilience. WWE didn't just give him victories, they gave him the responsibility of being a hero. Children grew up seeing him as a moral standard, where strength always comes with kindness, where failure is never allowed to be the end. Outside the ring, he stepped into Hollywood, starring in blockbusters, conquering cinema with iron discipline and a work ethic that even veteran stars respected. And above all, granting over 650 Make-A-Wish wishes turned him into a hero who needs no stage, appearing in the quietest hospital rooms where fame means nothing, only life and death remain. In the public eye, John Cena is living proof of the American dream: hard work, discipline, never giving up, and ultimately glory. But it was from that very moment that his tragedy began to form, silently and unseen by anyone. Because when a person is placed on a pedestal as an icon, they are no longer allowed to be themselves. Cena is not allowed to be weak, not allowed to be tired, not allowed to collapse even for a moment. When all of America relies on his image to believe that effort is always rewarded, he no longer has the right to seek support for himself. Every step carries the expectations of millions. Every small mistake could become a betrayal to the children who believed in him with all their innocence. So Cena learned to swallow his pain, hide his hurt behind his familiar smile, turn his body into a fortress, and his emotions into something that must be absolutely controlled. In America, people celebrate those who never fall, but rarely ask what they had to sacrifice to stay standing. John Cena stands at the peak of admiration, but also inside an invisible cage built from expectations, responsibility, and a perfect image. When the whole country needs him to be strong, he is forced to be strong, even when he's no longer sure how much longer he can endure. And from there the most painful question begins to echo, not on the wrestling mat, but in the quietest moments of his life. What happens to a person when their entire life only allows them to be strong, and never allows them to fall? In solitude, John Cena learned a brutal lesson: if no one protects you, you have to protect yourself. But that boy had no power, no status, no voice. The only thing he could control was his own body, and so the gym entered his life not as a dream or ambition, but as a refuge. The cold iron weights didn't ask who he was, didn't mock him, didn't betray him. They simply demanded he lift them up, put them down, repeat until his muscles burned and his lungs were nearly empty. There, physical pain became clear, specific, measurable. It was different from the vague spiritual helplessness out there, the nameless, formless pain with no way to fight back. In the gym, at least he knew what he was enduring for, and when the pain passed he was a little stronger. Gradually, training became a survival ritual. Every session was a silent vow that he would never let anyone make him feel small again. Muscles grew not just to impress, but to build armor. The boy who once bowed his head to avoid others' gazes began learning to stand straight, not out of confidence, but out of fear that if he didn't appear strong, the world would tear him apart again. But along with the muscles, something else grew inside him: emotional callousness. Every time he was hurt without protection, he learned to swallow the pain, treat it as normal. Pain was no longer a warning signal, it became something to accept if he wanted to survive. No one told John Cena that what he was going through was unfair. No one taught him how to name his fear or how to seek help, so he wrote his own rules for life. Don't complain, don't be weak, don't expect anyone to save you. Those rules helped him survive his early years, but they also quietly laid the foundation for a longer tragedy, because when a child learns to see pain as normal, they also learn to distrust tenderness. Comfort becomes foreign, while endurance becomes familiar. And from there, even later when standing before tens of thousands cheering, a part of John Cena remained that boy from long ago, always ready to brace himself, always believing that if he relaxed even a little, the world would immediately punish him. The gym was never a place that nurtured his dreams. It was where he escaped fear, Every drop of sweat on the floor was a silent plea for this pain to cover the other pain. Physical pain, no matter how intense, was still easier to bear than the spiritual helplessness of being isolated and abandoned. And from that paradox, John Cena grew up carrying a belief that both saved and destroyed him, that if he was strong enough, tough enough, no one could hurt him anymore. But he didn't know that the price of that belief was living his whole life on guard, where weakness was never allowed to appear, and where pain, though familiar, never truly went away. As John Cena moved through his teenage years and into early adulthood, the gym was no longer just a refuge from fear. It gradually became the center of his entire inner world. Workouts were no longer simply to get stronger, they became a harsh discipline, almost self-punishing in nature. Cena didn't train for fun or relaxation, he trained as if paying a debt to something invisible. Every morning began with iron. Every evening ended with exhausted muscles. Only when his body hurt so much that sensations blurred, did his mind temporarily go quiet, and in that silence he found what childhood had taken: a sense of control. Muscles growing day by day didn't just change John Cena's appearance, they changed how he existed in the world. Others' gazes began to falter. The mocking stopped. No one easily pushed or belittled him anymore. And in that moment, Cena believed he had found the formula for survival: if the body is strong enough, the world won't dare hurt you anymore. But that formula had a dark side he didn't see. The more he controlled his body, the more he suppressed his emotions. Fatigue, fear, sadness, all pushed to the bottom, seen as signs of weakness. He didn't allow himself to complain, because in the world he built there were only two states: endure or fail. Training gradually became mandatory, not a choice. Days without training made him anxious, as if his armor had been removed in the middle of battle. His body was no longer a safe home. It was a tool that had to function perfectly. Every meal was measured, every hour of sleep calculated, every minute of rest carried guilt. Rest meant letting go meant danger. John Cena didn't live in his body, he guarded it, monitored it, forced it to meet ever harsher standards, and in the process he unwittingly turned himself into his own jailer. Emotions, already fragile from childhood, now had no place at all. He didn't learn to listen to himself, he learned to ignore. When sad, he lifted heavier weights. When angry, he extended the session. When empty, he trained until he had no strength to think. The body became the burial ground for every emotion not allowed to exist. People saw a disciplined, determined, admirable young man, but no one saw the price of that discipline. Every centimeter of muscle was a centimeter of emotion sacrificed. Every time the body grew stronger, the inner world closed tighter. John Cena gradually believed his worth was tied to his ability to endure. If he stayed standing, he was worthy of existing. If he fell, he returned to being that weak boy from before, the one no one protected. That fear kept him from letting up even for a day. He lived in constant tension, like a string pulled so tight that relaxing even slightly would snap it. But instead of relaxing, he pulled tighter, because tightening, at least, was something he knew how to do. Over time, the body was no longer a place to return to after life's blows. It became a battlefield where he constantly proved to himself he was tough enough. Muscle aches, small injuries, signs of fatigue. He treated them as normal, even necessary. Physical pain, as he had learned as a child, was far easier than spiritual helplessness. And so he accepted living with pain, seeing it as a loyal companion. But that companion gradually took over his living space, allowing nothing soft to exist. Looking back at this period, it's clear John Cena traded very early. He traded the ability to be weak for safety. He traded listening to himself for a sense of control. And while the outside world began to see him as a model of strength, inside he grew further from himself. The body was no longer home, where a person rests and recovers. It became a prison where he locked himself with unforgiving standards, where every passing day was a repeated sentence: be stronger than yesterday, or you're not allowed to exist. No one forced John Cena to do this, but no one taught him another way. In the world he grew up in, strength was the only language respected, and so he spoke that language more fluently, until he no longer remembered he once had other languages. The boy who once fled fear in the gym had now turned the gym into his entire world. And in that world, he was safe, but completely alone. When John Cena left college, what he carried wasn't a map for the future, but a vague yet persistent fear, the fear of being left behind. For many, the post-college years are a time to experiment, stumble, make mistakes, and learn to get back up. But for Cena, mistakes weren't lessons, they were threats. Failure, in the inner world shaped by childhood, wasn't just lack of success, it meant returning to being that weak boy who was bullied, unprotected, and learned to see pain as normal. So he didn't allow himself to drift or pause to ask what he really wanted. Standing still meant danger, slowing down meant falling behind, and falling behind in his mind was almost like death. After college, Cena tried professional bodybuilding and other vague paths, not because he craved fame, but because he needed a place to keep feeling in control. Every decision came not from passion but from existential panic. If I don't move forward, I'll disappear. There was no romance in those years, no sense of finding himself, just long, tense days where he constantly asked if he was strong enough, fast enough, intimidating enough. He didn't choose the easiest path, nor the one that would make him happiest. He chose the one that scared him least, even if it cost nameless exhaustion. John Cena didn't dare fail, because failure for him had no safety net. It wasn't a stopping point to rest, it was a bottomless pit. So he threw himself into anything that let him keep building strength, both physical and image. He didn't sit down to reflect or allow doubt, because doubt would open the door to fear. Every day had to have a goal, even if it was just don't get weaker. And so his career began, not with a clear dream, but with a survival reflex, keep moving to avoid being crushed by his own thoughts. When the opportunity for professional wrestling came, Cena seized it, not with the excitement of someone finding passion, but with the desperation of a drowning man. This was a brutal world, where the body is tested daily, pain is standard, and weakness is eliminated without mercy. For others, it might be hell. For Cena, it was familiar territory. Here, the rules were clear. Strong survive, weak disappear. No ambiguity, no gray areas. And in that harshness, he felt safe in a distorted way. At least he knew what to do: endure, advance, never retreat. But the price of never daring to stop was a life without pause. Cena didn't allow himself to breathe deeply, because every stop brought buried questions to the surface. He didn't ask if he was happy, he asked if he was strong enough. He didn't question where he was going, he forced himself to go faster. And year after year he built an identity based on constant motion, where self-worth was measured by endurance. There were nights after long training sessions, when his body ached so much he couldn't sleep. Cena lay still in the dark, and clearly felt a nameless emptiness, but he didn't let himself stay with that feeling. The next morning, he got up, trained again, pushed to new limits. Not because he loved pain, but because pain was the only thing he knew how to talk to. Silence scared him. Rest made him anxious. Weakness, even fleeting, made him feel he was sliding back to a place he swore never to return. Over time, Cena could no longer tell what was choice and what was reflex. His career formed not from a nurtured dream, but from a chain of decisions to avoid his deepest fear, fear of being seen as not enough. He didn't run toward the light, he ran from the darkness, and in that escape, he unwittingly built the foundation for a future empire, while locking himself in an unforgiving loop. The further he went, the harder it was to stop. The stronger he became, the more he feared the moment he might no longer be strong enough. John Cena's career began that way, not with the call of passion, but with the silent scream of existential panic. A young man at life's crossroads didn't choose the path that made his heart race. He chose the one that temporarily quieted his fear. And from that choice, he stepped into a journey that would take him to the top, but also force him to live his whole life fleeing, where weakness wasn't just something to avoid, but something he believed he couldn't survive facing. When John Cena officially entered WWE, it wasn't the glorious moment people imagine when dreams come true. There was no welcoming spotlight, no guarantee of the future. He entered a massive machine run on pressure, where people are measured not by dreams or emotions, but by endurance. There, WWE wasn't looking for a hero, they were looking for bodies that could be thrown into the non-stop grind of schedules, collisions, and pain. And John Cena, with his steel discipline and pain tolerance honed from years of self-punishment, became a perfect fit. He joined WWE as the prototype, a cold, emotionless name reflecting how the system saw him, an unfinished product with potential if polished long enough. The early days had no room for fragility. Cena quickly learned that in this world, no one asks how you feel. The only question is whether you can keep going. Where it hurts doesn't matter. As long as you stand when the music plays, no matter how exhausted, you can't show it, because someone is always ready to replace you. His value wasn't in who he was as a person, but in how many matches, injuries, and sleepless nights he could handle. WWE is a ruthless but honest environment. It doesn't pretend to care. It doesn't hide the rules. And John Cena, with a past accustomed to no one protecting him, adapted frighteningly fast. He didn't demand. He didn't complain. He worked more, trained longer, accepted roles others refused. Every time his body ached, he saw it as proof he was being used, that he still had value. In a world where being forgotten means disappearing, being used, no matter how, was better than being ignored. No one asked Cena if he was okay, because the system wasn't built to ask that question. And he didn't ask himself either. He was used to seeing pain as normal, even necessary. Every bruise, every minor injury, every lingering ache was recorded by him as a fee to pay to keep existing. He learned to smile as he stepped through the curtain, even when behind it was an exhausted body and an empty mind. The audience saw an energetic guy, while backstage witnessed a person living in constant tension, always ready to take on more burden. Gradually, John Cena understood that his silence was what made him reliable. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't make things difficult. He did what was asked, and did it better than required. In WWE, that was a valuable quality, but that very quality made him increasingly identified as a tool. He wasn't seen as an individual with limits, but as a resource to exploit. And Cena, who had grown up believing that as long as he was strong enough he'd be safe, continued to accept it without questioning. There were days he trained until he could no longer clearly feel his body. There were nights he lay in strange hotel rooms, listening to traffic outside and wondering if this was the life he had chosen. But that question was quickly pushed back. In WWE, doubt was a luxury. If he slowed down, the machine would keep going without him. And so he chose to move forward, not because he believed things would get better ahead, but because stopping was something he didn't dare face. John Cena's value in this period was tied tightly to his ability to endure pain. The better he endured, the more work he was given. The longer he endured, the more he proved he deserved to stay. No one said it directly, but it was there in every decision, every schedule, every glance. And Cena, who had learned as a child to measure his worth by endurance, kept doing what he knew best, gritting his teeth and bearing it. There was a bitter paradox here. WWE didn't see him as a hero, but his silent sacrifice gradually laid the foundation for him becoming a hero in the public's eyes later on. He was used, but in the process, he also learned how to operate in a harsh world. However, the price was growing further from the ability to listen to himself. Every time his body sounded a warning, he silenced it. Every time his mind grew weary, he forced himself to be stronger. He turned endurance into his identity, and that identity became the only thing he believed he could rely on. John Cena didn't enter WWE with illusions of being loved. He entered with determination to be used, and for a long time, that was enough to keep him going. But deep inside, a question that had never been asked still quietly existed, like a small crack waiting to spread. If one day he could no longer endure, if one day his body and mind both said no, then who would he be in a world that only knew him as a tool that could take pain? When John Cena put on the character of the Doctor of Thugonomics, it wasn't just a career turning point, it was a new survival mechanism forming. WWE needed him to have personality, the audience needed a memorable face, and Cena, accustomed to adapting to survive, found a perfect mask, humorous, arrogant, sharp-tongued, always stepping onto the stage, as if nothing in the world could hurt him. The doctor of thugonomics wasn't born from innate confidence, but from the deepest fear of a person too used to being looked down on. If he couldn't make the world respect him with gentleness, he would make them not dare underestimate him with laughter and defiance. The rap verses, the sarcastic lines, the mocking of opponents made the audience laugh, and WWE realized they had found what they needed. Cena was no longer an anonymous prototype. He became the one who owned the space, who made the crowd react. But few realized that behind that laughter was a person hiding growing insecurity. Humor for Cena wasn't pure joy, it was psychological armor, a way to strike first so he wouldn't be attacked. If he made himself the joke, no one could hurt him with mockery anymore. At least, that's what he believed. The doctor of thugonomics allowed Cena to say things that the real-life John Cena wouldn't dare. On stage he was bold, sharp, unafraid of confrontation. But when the lights went out, silence returned. His body still ached from the packed schedule. His mind was still tense from the pressure to prove his worth, and emotions, as usual, were pushed even deeper. The audience laughed at the arrogant raps, while Cena learned to endure in silence, as he had since childhood. There was a bitter paradox in this phase. The more he made others laugh, the more he had to suppress his own fear. Every applause was confirmation that the mask was working, and so he didn't dare remove it. If one day he no longer had the energy to laugh, to joke, to act carefree, would he still have value? That question lingered in his mind after every performance but was never spoken aloud. The doctor of thugonomics also put Cena in a new spiral. He had to always appear okay, even when he wasn't. On stage he mocked pain, turned collisions into entertainment. But backstage, the bruises, the lingering aches, the sleepless nights were real. His body kept taking the hits, while his mind kept learning to stay silent. Every laugh in front of the crowd was a reminder that real emotions had no place here. The audience didn't see the moments when Cena sat alone in the locker room, quietly unwrapping bandages from swollen joints. They didn't hear the sighs as he bowed his head in the darkness backstage. Those moments had no music, no cheers, just a person trying to keep from falling apart. But Cena didn't allow himself to linger there. The next day he stepped out again, laughed again, rapped again, played the role of someone who knew no fear. The doctor of thugonomics was so successful that it began to swallow him whole. The line between character and real person blurred. Cena didn't just play strong, he had to become strong. He didn't just act carefree, he had to learn not to feel. And so every time emotions rose, he pushed himself into more training, more work, more roles. Busyness became his way of avoiding facing himself. In WWE's eyes he was gold. In the audience's eyes, he was entertainment. But in his inner world, the doctor of thugonomics was a gilded cage. It protected him from direct hurt, but also trapped him in an image he didn't dare abandon. He knew the audience loved this version of him, and so he kept feeding it, even at the cost of accumulating exhaustion, day by day. There were moments amid the laughter and applause when a sudden emptiness washed over him. Cena stood in the ring, looking out at the sea of people, and felt distant from it all. They saw him, but they didn't see the real him. They heard him speak, but they didn't hear the fear compressed inside. And he accepted that, because long ago he had learned to exist without needing to be understood. The doctor of thugonomics taught John Cena a bitter lesson to be accepted. Sometimes you have to sacrifice authenticity. To be loved, sometimes you have to hide pain. And while the audience kept laughing, kept cheering, Cena kept walking his familiar path, the path where laughter rang on the surface, while beneath flowed a silent current of endurance. He learned to bleed without anyone seeing, to hurt without making a sound, because that was the price he was willing to pay to never return to the feeling of being abandoned and weak from long ago. When John Cena officially became the face of WWE, it was no longer just a career advancement, it was the moment he was locked into a role with no escape. He didn't just represent a company, he became the moral face of a billion-dollar entertainment empire. In WWE's eyes, Cena was safety, he was reliability. He was the one they could place at the center of every campaign, every show, every biggest stage without fear of collapse. And because of that, every image risk, every expectation, every responsibility was placed on his shoulders, as if he were the only one who could carry it. At that peak, Cena was no longer a wrestler climbing up, he was the one holding up the ceiling for the entire system. If he stood firm, WWE stood firm. If he broke, the empire could shake. To adult fans, Cena might just be a star, but to children, he was something much deeper. He was a moral role model, the hero who never betrays, proof that kindness can still win in a harsh world. Millions of American kids learned not to give up from his words, learned to get back up after failure from his image of always standing tall, always smiling, always saying the right thing. Cena wasn't just performing for the crowd, he was educating a generation, and that turned his role into an invisible yoke, because when you become the standard, you're no longer allowed to err, not allowed to tire, not allowed to be sad, not allowed to collapse. A moment of weakness is no longer personal. It could be seen as betrayal to the children who placed absolute faith in you. John Cena understood that better than anyone. He knew every action was scrutinized under the moral spotlight. Every word, every expression, every moment off the perfect image could become headlines. WB didn't say it outright, but the message was always there. He was the one not allowed to break. He was the pillar, and pillars aren't allowed to tremble, even if cracked inside. Cena stepped onto the stage every night, with his familiar smile, while behind it was a weary body, and a mind stretched like a wire. He didn't just fight opponents, he fought his own limits, and the fear that if he slowed, the machine would crush him without mercy. There was a cruel paradox at this peak. Cena was loved by millions, but not allowed to live for himself. He belonged to the public, to WBB, to the kids who believed he would always win, always stand for what's right, and in that belonging, he gradually lost the right to be sad. Exhausting days weren't allowed to exist, moments of self-doubt had to be hidden. Cena couldn't say "I'm not okay," because that would shatter an image built over years. He learned to smile when he wanted silence, learned to say "I'm fine" when his body and mind were crying for help. When WBB exploited that resilience to the maximum, packed schedules, media pressure, global representation duties, all piled onto one person. Cena became the company's shield, absorbing both love and hate from the public. Booed, criticized, divisive, but he still had to stand firm, because if he reacted, if he allowed hurt, the image would collapse. And in that world, collapse was unacceptable. Not for him, but for the millions taught to believe in him. This peak wasn't a place to enjoy, it was a place to endure. Cena wasn't allowed to tire, because tiredness meant weakness. Not allowed to be sad, because sadness would shake children's faith. Not allowed to collapse, because collapse was betrayal. Every day he had to prove he deserved the role, even though no one asked if he still had the strength. And so he kept pushing forward, kept swallowing pain, kept playing the hero even when full of cracks inside. There were moments, standing amid cheering crowds, when Cena clearly felt a cold distance. They saw him, but not the burden he carried. They chanted his name, but didn't hear the sighs in his heart, and he accepted that, because long ago he understood this role allowed no demands. Heroes aren't allowed breaks. Heroes aren't allowed to say they're tired. Heroes are only allowed to continue. The one mistake John Cena wasn't allowed to make wasn't losing a match, but shattering the faith of millions of kids. That fear kept him standing even when his legs shook. That fear made him keep smiling when sadness rose, and that fear turned the peak of his career into the peak of tragedy. Because when the whole world needs you strong, you no longer have the right to break. And John Cena, the man celebrated as an icon of resilience, learned to live in a painful paradox. The more he was loved, the less he was allowed to be human. When John Cena had become WBB's irreplaceable face, another truth gradually emerged, cold and undeniable. He no longer belonged to himself. He belonged to the crowd, to the cheers and the boos, to the conflicting expectations pulling him taut like a wire about to snap. In every city, every arena, Cena stepped out into a wave of emotions that was never the same. Some places loved him like a saint, others hated him like a villain. The "Let's Go Cena" chants clashed with "Cena sucks," overlapping, tearing the air. And in the middle of it all, he stood smiling, raising his hand, as if everything was fine. But deep inside, he knew he was owned by the crowd in a way no one saw. The public's love didn't bring Cena safety. It brought responsibility. Responsibility to meet every expectation, even contradictory ones. One person wanted him as a flawless moral icon. Another wanted him gone from center stage. Kids saw him as a hero. Adults were tired of that hero image. And Cena was stretched between those extremes, not allowed to lean fully either way. If he changed, he betrayed half the audience. If he stayed the same, he carried the hate of the other half. In that world, there was no right choice, only the one that caused the least collapse. There was no real private life for someone living like that. When he left the stage, Cena entered identical hotel rooms in different cities, with the same heavy silence, door closed, lights dimmed. The cheers still echoed in his head, repeating like an endless loop. He sat on the bed's edge, removed his shoes, unwrapped bandages, revealing a body worn down by hundreds of nights of impact. But what tired him most wasn't the muscles, it was the mind that never rested. The crowd was no longer in front of him, but still inside him, in every thought, every worry about tomorrow's reaction. Cena had no concept of clocking out like others. Work didn't end when the music stopped. His role followed him into elevators, hotel rooms, solitary meals. He always had to guard his image. A careless word, a caught moment of fatigue, a wrong expression, all could become proof of a decline the public wouldn't accept. So even in solitude, he didn't fully relax. He lived as if an invisible camera was always watching. Some nights, Cena turned on the TV just to break the silence, but the screen's sound only made him feel emptier. He saw himself on it, strong, confident, always in control, and that contrast made it hard to breathe. The man on screen and the one in the hotel room were the same person, but they weren't allowed to meet. One belonged to the crowd, the other didn't know where he belonged, and so he turned off the TV, leaving the room in silence, the only place he could hear his heartbeat and feel a loneliness with no audience. Being loved and hated at once was a subtle form of isolation. Cena couldn't fully trust the love because it could vanish after one creative decision or image change. He couldn't react to the hate because reacting meant breaking the role assigned to him. So he learned to stand still at the storm's center, enduring both sides, as if that was the default price of his position. But the longer he stood, the more hollow he felt, like a shell applauded from outside but empty within. There was no one he could fully share that with. Relationships grew fragile when schedules allowed no presence. Friends couldn't understand the pressure of someone not allowed to break, and Cena himself wasn't good at opening up. Long ago he had learned to keep everything to himself. Weakness wasn't something he was taught to show, and so instead of seeking comfort, he chose silence. Silence on late-night flights, silence in solitary meals, silence in hotel rooms where cheers still rang even though the crowd had long gone. The crowd's ownership didn't come from malice, it came from love, from expectations, from seeing a part of themselves in him. But for Cena, that ownership was still a form of lost freedom. He wasn't allowed to disappear to recover, wasn't allowed to say he was overloaded, wasn't allowed to slow down when the entire system needed him to keep going. And so he kept stepping out every night, kept smiling, kept enduring, as if that was obvious. Somewhere amid the chants and the boos, John Cena gradually realized a painful truth. He was seen by millions, but rarely seen as the person he truly was. The crowd knew his image, not his fears. They knew his slogan, not his sleepless nights. And he accepted that, because the role he carried didn't allow those revelations. The hero had to stand firm, even if standing alone. And so, when the stage lights went out, when the hotel door closed, John Cena remained with himself in thick silence. The cheers still echoed in his head, like a reminder that tomorrow he would step out again, belong to the crowd again. But in that brief moment between midnight and nameless walls, he was just a lonely person, carrying the weight of love and hate on his shoulders, and learning to live with fame's most painful paradox, being owned by millions, but having no place to truly belong. As the stage lights faded and the cheers became only echoes in his head, John Cena entered another battlefield, quieter and more incomprehensible than any ring he'd ever stood in. Love. Here there was no clear script, no announced rules, and most importantly, no way to fully control it. For someone who had lived his whole life through discipline, endurance, and control, it was a world both alluring and terrifying. Cena didn't enter love with malice. He entered with a desire to connect, to feel safe, to build a home after years of living in hotels and backstages. But the very survival mechanisms that kept him standing in public became barriers in his private life. His first marriage ended not because of betrayal, not violence, not lack of respect. It ended because two people lived at different rhythms. Cena was used to planning, setting rules, keeping everything in hand. He loved with responsibility, with protection, with the sense that he had to do it right. But love doesn't run on checklists or schedules. It needs softness, the ability to hear what's unsaid, acceptance of uncertainty. And there, Cena faltered, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to let go without feeling he was losing himself. When the marriage ended, it left a silent crack, the first time absolute control didn't save him. Then came the relationship watched by the whole world, where every private moment was scrutinized under public lights. Engagement, promises, smiles on the biggest stages, it all looked like the happy ending the audience expected. But behind it, old questions returned with greater intensity. Love demands presence, while Cena's life was a chain of absences. Love needs flexibility, while he was programmed to hold structure. Differences in desires, futures, ways of living gradually became irreconcilable. There was no villain in this story. Just two people who loved each other but couldn't find a common language soft enough to reach one another. Cena wasn't cruel when setting boundaries. He did it out of fear. Fear that if he let go, everything would collapse. Fear that without control, he'd return to the helplessness of childhood, where things happened beyond his will. But love doesn't accept constant defense. It needs vulnerability, the ability to say, "I'm not okay," without fear of judgment. And that was something Cena had never been taught. He could stand before tens of thousands, but didn't know how to stand before one loved one with a bare heart. When the engagement ended, it wasn't just a relationship over. It was a painful confrontation with a limit he couldn't overcome through strength. Cena was used to fixing mistakes with more effort, tighter discipline, pushing himself harder. But here, the harder he tried, the wider the gap. He couldn't love like a normal person, because his life had never been normal. Schedules, public image, iconic responsibility, all crowded into moments that should have been private and natural. There were nights in familiar hotel rooms, when Cena sat alone and wondered why fights he could win slipped through his fingers in relationships he cherished. The answer wasn't lack of feeling, but that he'd learned to live without deep intimacy for too long. Intimacy requires trusting that another won't hurt you when you're weak. For Cena, that trust was hard to form. He wasn't used to being protected, so he wasn't used to letting someone in deep enough to potentially hurt him. Those breakups didn't make him bitter, they made him quieter. He learned to keep his private life discreet, not out of shame but understanding he needed a space without crowd expectations. But that discretion was another layer of armor, helping him continue avoiding direct confrontation with helplessness before intimacy. He kept wondering if he could love without control, connect without fearing loss of self. The tragedy in John Cena's love life had no clear villain, no one intentionally hurt anyone. Just old scars clashing with new desires, neither soft enough to adapt. He wasn't cruel in pulling back. He did it because he didn't know how to stay without breaking the mechanisms that helped him survive. And in each goodbye, what he lost wasn't just a loved one, but another chance to learn he could be loved even when imperfect. Looking back, John Cena understood some battles can't be won with strength, some relationships can't be held with control, but understanding didn't mean knowing how to change. He kept walking, carrying the quiet sadness of a man used to carrying everything alone. Love had knocked gently and sincerely, but when it asked for softness he hadn't learned. He could only stand still, helpless, watching it leave. And in that silence, John Cena once again faced his life's familiar paradox, strong enough to endure loss, but never taught how not to endure alone. After years of trading emotions, sleep and private life to maintain the hero role, John Cena began facing an enemy who couldn't overpower his own body. For a long time he'd been used to seeing pain as background noise, the default price for existence. Injuries accumulated from hundreds of matches, repeated impacts, schedules without recovery, all accepted as part of the job. Body hurts, train more. Body tired, discipline harder. In his world, never give up wasn't just a slogan, it was a command, and that command took him further than most. But it also made him believe something dangerous, that the body would always obey will. Then came a point when the body spoke in a way he couldn't ignore, not with familiar muscle aches, not bruises that could be taped, but a silent, far more frightening warning. When John Cena was first diagnosed with skin cancer, the world didn't know. No music, no lights, no crowd, just a person facing the truth that in his own body, cells had betrayed order. For the first time, he faced something strength, discipline, and will couldn't fully control. No exercise could lift cells back into place. No effort could negotiate with illness. Skin cancer didn't come to John Cena as a loud tragedy, but its quietness made it haunting. It didn't ask how much he'd endured, didn't care who he'd inspired. It just existed, indifferent to slogans. And when he overcame it the first time, he didn't celebrate. He went back to work, back to training, back to the familiar role, as if stopping to reflect would let fear swallow him. But the body remembered, and it reminded him again when the cancer returned. The second time, the blow was heavier, not because of the disease's severity, but its meaning. This was no longer a rare accident. It was a clear message that the body has limits, and those limits can't be overcome with blind faith. John Cena, who had spent his life proving he never gives up, for the first time had to admit some battles aren't won by pushing forward. Some are only survived by listening and stopping at the right time. What unsettled him most wasn't physical pain, but loss of control. The body, turned into a fortress, was no longer an absolute ally. It had its own rhythm, needs, warnings. Surgical scars weren't just on the skin. They cut deep into how he saw himself. For the first time he couldn't push through with pure endurance. For the first time never give up wasn't a complete answer. At the same time accumulated career injuries began demanding payment. Every morning waking up, his body stiffened, reminding him years without rest had left marks. Movements once instinctive now needed warm-up time. Pains once ignored became persistent. Cena could no longer pretend everything would be fine by smiling and stepping out. His body, finally, said no. For someone whose entire identity was built on endurance, that moment was stripping. It took away the illusion that enough determination overcomes anything. It forced him to face that humans aren't machines, and will isn't a cure-all. Never give up didn't cure diseased cells. The phrase, once a compass, now became a question needing reinterpretation, slowly and painfully. John Cena didn't collapse before illness, but he couldn't continue as before. Every mirror glance showed not just muscle, but traces of fragility. Every training session, he had to learn to stop before limits, something he'd never done. This change didn't happen in one moment, but in a series of small, difficult choices: rest instead of push, listen instead of ignore, accept instead of force. The most painful part was relearning a seemingly simple lesson. Survival doesn't always mean advancing. Sometimes survival means stepping back. For someone who'd spent life fleeing weakness, it was an inner revolution. He could no longer see the body as unlimited tool. He had to treat it as an entity needing protection, not exploitation. These physical events didn't strip John Cena's will, but forced him to redefine it. Will was no longer enduring to the end, but knowing when to stop to continue. And in that redefinition, he faced a new fear. If no longer invincible, if no longer always standing tall, then who was he? That question hung in recovery days, checkups, silent moments, where he realized the body was no longer a prison he controlled, but a living being with its own voice. John Cena emerged from facing illness not with triumph, but humility. He knew he'd been lucky, but he also knew luck isn't permanent. Never give up remained, but no longer a challenge to limits. It became a quiet reminder: don't give up on yourself, even if it means accepting you can't control everything. And in that acceptance, John Cena began a new life phase, where strength was measured not by pain endurance, but by listening to what body and life were trying to tell him. After his body forced him to slow down, another challenge, suppler and more cruel, quietly arrived. The way the world saw him began to change. John Cena, the man who'd spent his life as a role model, was suddenly pulled into an unchosen role, becoming a joke. Not in the ring, where boos were scripted, but online, where everything is distorted, edited, spread uncontrollably. Memes appeared everywhere. Short videos, quotes ripped from context, images exaggerated to absurdity. The icon built on discipline and sacrifice was bent into a punchline for instant laughs. At first glance, it seemed harmless. The internet always needs a new joke, and John Cena, with global recognition, was perfect material. But for someone who'd lived carefully guarding his image, this shift carried a hard-to-name hurt, not because he didn't get humor, not because he wasn't tough enough for teasing, but because this laughter came not from stage consent, but distortion beyond control. The man who once controlled every image detail was now turned into a consumable icon, chewed up and spat out in seconds of scrolling. There was a bitter paradox here. Cena had accepted boos, hate, opposition, as part of the hero role in a polarized world. But anonymous, faceless, contextless mockery touched a different insecurity. It echoed childhood feelings of being a target of ridicule, with no one defending him. Only now, the playground was global, and the crowd didn't need to know him to laugh. The internet didn't ask what he'd sacrificed, didn't ask how long he'd held the icon role. It just needed a funny moment. And so the man once honored for seriousness, for never-give-up spirit, was reduced to seconds of entertainment. For many that's peak fame. But for Cena, it was another loss of control. He no longer decided how he was seen. His image no longer belonged fully to him, or WWE. It belonged to algorithms, trends, fleeting laughs from people who'd never known what he'd been through. John Cena didn't react strongly, didn't speak out, didn't show bitterness, because long ago, he'd learned silent endurance. But silence didn't mean no pain. Some nights scrolling those edits, he clearly felt a different weariness, weary of being misunderstood, weary that a lifetime's serious efforts were reduced to a gag. The man who weighed every word for kids now became an image needing no context to exist. An icon bent that way didn't destroy him, but eroded something vital, feeling respected. Cena didn't demand worship, he'd never needed a pedestal, but he needed to be seen as a complete person, not just a facial expression, or detached quote. And when the online world turned him into a punchline, he had to face that modern fame no longer distinguishes honor from consumption. The deepest pain was the overlapping roles. To kids, he was still the hero. To WWE, still the icon. But to the internet, just a repeating joke. Three images coexisted, pulling him three ways. And Cena, as usual, didn't allow vulnerability. He kept appearing with smiles, working, maintaining propriety. But inside, a quiet question formed. Do serious sacrifices still have a place in a world needing only seconds of fun? Becoming a mockery target didn't break John Cena, but it forced a new, equally painful lesson. Even living right kindly, responsibly, you can still be twisted into what others want to see. That an image, no matter how carefully built, can be bent in an instant, and ultimately, you can't control how the world consumes you. In that bitter acceptance, John Cena once again chose silence over resistance, not because weak, but because he knew resistance would only amplify the mockery cycle. He held what remained in his grasp, how he treated others, values he wouldn't abandon, private moments, where he didn't have to be anyone's punchline. The man who'd spent life as an example now became a mockery of a new era. But his way of not responding with bitterness, not retaliating with contempt, quietly showed another strength. The strength of not letting cheap laughter define his whole self. And amid the internet noise, John Cena learned to protect his last serious part, not by reclaiming the bent image, but by continuing to live by the values that kept him standing from the start. He accepted the world could laugh, tease, distort, but in the deepest place, with no memes or algorithms, he remained the man who knew what he'd been through, what he'd endured, and still chose not to let mockery strip the most important things, self-respect and humanity he'd spent a lifetime preserving. There is a part of John Cena's life the stage lights never touched, where there was no soundtrack, no script, no cheers. Those were the quiet hospital rooms, where antiseptic smells mixed with the weak breaths of children, nearing life's final boundary. More than 650 times, John Cena entered those rooms with his familiar smile, arms ready to embrace, voice trying to stay steady, and more than 650 times, he left in silence, carrying goodbyes with no promise of return. These weren't victories, these were farewells, and each farewell left an unseen crack. Make-A-Wish calls him when the children don't have much time left, when hope has shrunk to one final wish, and Cena never refuses, not for image obligations, not for media, but because he understands the feeling of being abandoned, understands what it's like to wish someone would show up at the right moment. He comes to them not as a superstar, but as a big friend. He kneels down to eye level. He listens to innocent stories of dreams that never got to live. He laughs, takes photos, signs autographs, and in that moment, the room lights up. For them it's magic, for him it's a wordless responsibility. But every magic has its price. Cena quickly learned that he isn't allowed to cry in front of them, isn't allowed to show fear, isn't allowed to let sadness spill over. He is their last joyful moment, the warm memory their families will hold on to when everything else is gone. So he smiles, he hugs, he says gentle, encouraging words, even knowing some battles can't be won. And when the hospital room door closes behind him, he swallows the pain, as he's done his whole life. Some children hold his hand very tightly, as if afraid to let go and the magic will vanish. Some whisper that they're not afraid of dying, only of being forgotten, and Cena promises they won't be forgotten. He promises with his presence, by giving them that entire moment fully, no matter the overlapping schedules, no matter the weary body. He knows that for them, those few minutes are a whole world, and he gives it away, time after time, keeping nothing for himself. But every goodbye is a small stab. Cena never knows which child will be the last. Some he sees again, some he doesn't. Messages come later, short calls, cold news that the child has passed. Cena doesn't post anything on social media, doesn't share with the press. He keeps those names in his memory, where they stack up into a silent graveyard. Some nights he recalls each face, each voice, and wonders if his smile was enough to ease their fear in the final moment. The cruelest part is that he's not allowed to collapse from those deaths. He is the symbol of hope. The bearer of hope isn't allowed to show despair, so Cena learns to compartmentalize emotions. To the world, he's still the hero. Backstage, he's still the professional. But in rare moments alone, sadness rises like a tide with no shore. He doesn't cry loudly. He cries in silence, cries by training to exhaustion, cries by working more, cries by continuing to the next goodbye. There is a painful paradox in those visits. Cena gives hope, but carries pain home. Every hug is a promise he can't fully keep. Every smile is a silent sacrifice. He becomes a refuge for their fears, but has no refuge for his own. The families thank him with grateful eyes that need no words, and Cena accepts it, not as a medal, but as a weight on his chest. Time doesn't fade these memories. It only lets them settle deeper. Some days he steps onto the stage, hears the cheers, and suddenly remembers a hospital room where the steady beeps of machines replaced applause. Sometimes when children run up for autographs, he smiles, but images flash of children who can no longer run. Those memories don't stop him, they make him continue. But the price is an emotional weariness he's never publicly admitted. Cena has never told the full story of those 650 goodbyes, not out of humility, but because he knows if he opens that door, everything will flood out. He keeps them in a private corner, with no cameras, no audience, where he allows himself to admit there are deaths he's not allowed to cry for, not because they don't hurt, but because if he cried, he couldn't continue bringing hope to others. And so he chooses the familiar endurance, silence, and moving forward. The peak of emotional tragedy in John Cena's life isn't in losses or mockery. It's in having to smile in rooms where life is fading. It's in having to say goodbye knowing it's forever. It's in having to be light for others, while learning to live with his own darkness. He doesn't boast. He doesn't demand recognition. He just keeps coming, keeps hugging, keeps smiling. And when night falls, when the world is quiet, John Cena carries 650 names, 650 faces, 650 unfinished stories. They don't break him, but they bend him quietly, little by little. He gives away hope as if it's the most natural thing in the world, but each time he gives, a part of him stays forever in those rooms. And perhaps that's the greatest sacrifice, with no applause, carrying the pain of goodbyes with no return, and still continuing to step out, to live, to believe that being there, even for a moment, was worth it, even when the price is a heart that must learn to endure losses, never allowed to cry out loud. After more than 650 goodbyes he's not allowed to cry for, John Cena realizes a simple but painful truth. If he keeps letting the whole world into every corner of his life, he'll have nothing left to keep, not because he's stopped loving people, but because he's given too much. So he chooses silence, not the cold silence of someone scorning the public, but the cautious silence of a person trying to preserve the last fragile part of himself. In a world that always demands explanations, Cena decides he no longer owes them. His marriage happens quietly, without fanfare, without stages, without promises framed for cameras. It's not fleeing love, but his way of staying with it. After previous breakups, he understands feelings can't survive under constant scrutiny. He no longer wants to prove he's happy, no longer wants his private life to be evidence for any public narrative. Love, this time, needs quiet to exist, and quiet is something he has to learn to protect. Even if it costs being misunderstood as distant, John Cena begins withdrawing from the spotlight as quietly as possible. Fewer appearances, less talking, less responding. Not because he's stopped caring, but because every time he opens the door for the world, he loses another piece of peace. He's too used to being misinterpreted, edited, turned into icon or joke. And after all those years, he realizes not every battle needs fighting. Some things just need protecting. Silence becomes a survival mechanism. It lets him breathe. It lets him exist without always playing hero or moral example. In silence, he doesn't have to explain why he's tired, why he's changed, why he no longer wants center stage. He no longer wants public understanding, because misunderstanding hurts more than not being understood. And he's had enough of those hurts. Some say he's become closed off. Some think he's colder. But few know that closeness is the result of many losses. Every boundary built isn't to exclude but to protect. Cena learns to say no to things that once defined him. Not because they're bad, but because he's exceeded endurance limits. He no longer wants private life consumed like content. No longer wants his love speculated on. No longer wants to answer questions he himself has no answers for. In those withdrawal days, he finds small joys without witnesses, mornings without schedules, meals without rush, ordinary moments where no one needs signatures, advice, or him representing something grand. For others that's normal. For Cena it's luxury, and he guards it with resolute silence. Silence doesn't weaken him, it makes him more real to himself. No longer reacting to every public wave, no longer proving he's okay. He allows himself not to be okay in safe spaces without lenses. He understands recovery doesn't happen before crowds. It needs time, privacy, respect for his new limits. Another paradox in this choice. The quieter he is, the more curiosity. But this time he doesn't yield. He's learned not all curiosity needs satisfying. Not all stories need telling. And not all versions of him belong to the public. A part of his life finally is kept for him. John Cena no longer wants understanding from millions. He just wants it from a few, and first from himself. He's spent too many years living by expectations not his own. Now he chooses to live by his body's rhythm, his emotions, real relationships, no noise, no declarations, just a necessary step back to not dissolve. That withdrawal isn't the journey's end, but a transition, from always stepping forward. He learns to stand still without guilt. From always present, he learns absence without feeling betrayal. Because if there's one thing he's learned from all the losses, No one can give forever without keeping something for themselves. And so John Cena retreats, not to disappear, but to survive. His silence isn't emptiness, but healing space. A space where he's not icon, not punchline, not hope-bearer for others, just a person learning to protect what's little, but most precious left: peace, privacy, and the right to live without always standing tall before the world. At 48, John Cena no longer runs, at least not the way he used to. No more training sessions like punishment, no more self-imposed packed schedules to avoid facing emotions. But that doesn't mean the burdens are gone, they've just changed shape. At 48, his body still stands, toned, disciplined, like a reminder he's lived by endurance. But every morning waking up, pain seeps through joints, through back muscles, like indelible words of a contract signed with time. Pain no longer explodes, it's persistent. Pain like a low background sound, never off. Sleepless nights become familiar companions, not from cheers or lights, from memories. When the house is quiet, when the outside world stops demanding, the years not allowed to fall return, he lies there staring at the ceiling, remembering nights stepping onto stages while his body begged for mercy, remembering smiles trained into reflex, remembering saying "I'm fine," while inside was a storm. At 48, he no longer needs to prove it to anyone. But old habits don't vanish just because you're tired. John Cena looks back on the path with a calm mixed with bitterness. He has no regrets. He knows he's done what needed doing, kept promises to millions, become a role model for children who believe resilience is worth valuing. But at the same time, he recognizes a hard truth: for many years, he wasn't allowed to fall. Not because he didn't want to, but because an entire system needed him standing. And when a person lives too long standing tall, they forget what it's like to sit down, to lean, to let go. The muscles are still there, the discipline is still there, but relief isn't. It doesn't come just because he's slowed. It doesn't come just because he's quieter. Relief, it turns out, isn't automatic reward for longest endurance. It needs something John Cena hasn't practiced in a long time: forgiving himself for not stopping sooner. And that's the hardest. Because in the world he grew up in, stopping always meant giving up, and giving up was what he swore never to do. At 48, he begins learning a new language for the old slogan. Never give up no longer means pushing forward no matter what. It means knowing when to set the burden down without shame, allowing himself tiredness without self-condemnation, accepting some scars don't need to become medals. But learning a new language after a lifetime speaking another is slow. Some days he manages. Some days he falls back into old habits, blaming himself for still hurting, still sad, still not relieved as expected of an icon. He looks in the mirror and sees two people coexisting, one still standing tall, broad-shouldered, determined eyes, the other more weary, quieter, carrying questions needing no answers. The two don't clash, they learn to coexist. John Cena doesn't try erasing his past. He knows without those years not allowed to fall, there'd be no him today. But he no longer glorifies endurance as absolute ideal. He begins respecting limits as another form of courage. Some evenings when back pain reminds him to get up and move, he thinks of times he's stood firm for others, thinks of children who held his hand, of audiences who believed in him, of promises kept, and then he allows one more thought: who stood firm for him? That question carries no resentment, just a belated truth, that there were years he did it all alone, and the price of doing it all alone is accumulated weariness with no payoff day. At 48, John Cena doesn't seek absolute relief. He knows some burdens will stay till the end. He only seeks honesty. Honesty with his body when it hurts, honesty with his mind when weary, honesty with emotions when they no longer want silence. He no longer needs to stand before the world saying he's strong. He just needs to stand before himself, admitting he did his best in circumstances that allowed no weakness. The muscles are still there, like milestones of an undeniable journey, but relief, it turns out, isn't in the muscles. It's in moments he allows himself not to be icon, not hero, not answer for anyone else. Just a 48-year-old man carrying aches, insomnia, memories, and deeper understanding of effort's value and sacrifice's price. And perhaps in that understanding, even if relief hasn't come, he's closer to another peace, not victory's peace, but peace of no longer proving he never falls. John Cena doesn't fall. No, he never fell, at least not in the public's eyes, at least not on the stages where millions placed faith in him. But the story doesn't end with glorious victory, or complete joy. He doesn't win completely. Because in that journey, the aching body, exhausted mind, lonely moments no lights or cheers can erase, all still exist. External success is just the shell, while inside is a weary but persistent man, kind but still solitary, continuing to live, to walk through each day with deep understanding of effort's worth and sacrifice's cost. He looks back on the life he's lived, and realizes that every time he got up after failure, every time he smiled despite a heavy heart, every time he hugged a child without daring to cry, were silent debts he willingly paid. What he'll be with actor. Statistics and external glory never fully reflect the price he paid for that resilience. Every accumulated injury, every sleepless night, every time he was misunderstood or turned into a joke on social media, all are evidence of endurance no one else had to carry. But thanks to those challenges, John Cena continues to be a living example, not a perfect one, not flawless, but one of someone who knows how to endure, who knows silent sacrifice, who knows how to love and give even when never allowed to be weak himself. He has learned to accept his own limits, to live with nameless pains, and to find precious moments amid a life full of pressure. He gets up every day, not for the lights or fame, but out of responsibility to himself, to the values he's chosen to uphold, and to those who believed in him. The message to America, to all who see John Cena as an icon, is a reminder of the price of resilience. We love those who never fall, those who serve as examples, those who show the world strength and sacrifice. But rarely does anyone ask what did they have to trade to stay standing. John Cena paid with loneliness, with silent pains, with years unable to live fully for himself, and that very price makes his victories and moments meaningful, but also fits the hollow feeling of someone unable to grant himself rest. It can be said that John Cena, who stood at the peak of glory, is living proof of a stark truth. No height comes without a price. External success doesn't equal inner peace. Medals, titles, cheers can't heal sleepless nights, can't erase times the body betrayed will, can't replace broken relationships or moments he had to shield himself from loneliness. He learned to stand firm, but the price of standing firm is never being allowed to fall, and thus never fully finding relief. John Cena is left as a weary man who still continues to live, still keeps his kindness, still knows how to love and keep giving hope. He no longer needs blinding lights, no longer needs fans to understand the full story behind his smile, because he's learned to find value in the simplest things, his child's laughter, quiet conversations, silent moments where he doesn't have to play a role. And in that quietness, John Cena leaves a profound message, a haunting conclusion, like a subdued light we can't forget. There are people who spend their whole lives being a support for millions of others, and never learn how to lean on anyone. That's John Cena. An imperfect icon, a man who endured too much, and an example of resilience, silent sacrifice, and the ability to keep living even knowing nothing in life is free. And perhaps, in those very scars, in learning to accept his limits, lies the greatest value he gives the world, proof that true strength isn't in never falling, but in getting up after every fall, even when it means paying a price few know about. The story of John Cena is a vivid testament to the image of a great but imperfect person, an icon built not just on muscle strength or fame, but on silent sacrifices and hidden pains the public rarely knows. From a childhood of bullying, seeking safety in the gym, to adult years tied to harsh discipline, endurance, and emotional suppression, Cena turned fear into motivation to rise, to become the icon millions of American children follow. His WWE career, with world championships, the face of the company role, and intense wrestling nights, wasn't just victories over opponents, but over his own body and mind limits. Health events, from accumulated injuries to skin cancer twice, remind that strength and will are never immune miracles, and every stand costs real pain. The quietest beauty in Cena's story is how he brings hope to others while burying his own pain. Over 650 Make-A-Wish grants, hugs and smiles for children at life's edge, and withdrawing from the spotlight to protect his private life. He is not just an icon of victory, but a model of kindness, of rising despite knowing no one fully understands the endurance behind his smile. The lesson for Americans from this story is awareness that resilience's value ties to personal responsibility and understanding one's limits. We love those who never fall, but rarely stop to ask what they traded. Cena teaches that true strength isn't in never falling, but in continuing after each fall, in protecting oneself, loving others, and finding meaning in quiet moments. In a society full of pressure and expectations, this lesson reminds us that to care for and give to others, we must first learn to value and protect ourselves, to stand tall, but also know when to stop, breathe, and recover. If you find John Cena's story inspiring, and it evokes appreciation for silent sacrifices, please subscribe so you don't miss the next emotional chapters. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video as we explore more stories of strength, resilience, and the kindness of extraordinary people.